welcome to this Adaptation Forum. As you know, this is the annual flagship event of the UNFCCC's Adaptation Committee. And the main goal of this year's Adaptation Forum is firstly to help you, the delegates of the Adaptation Futures Conference, to hear about the adaptation-relevant outcomes of the Paris Climate Conference, in particular the Paris Agreement, and to collect your input, scientific and practical, for the Adaptation Committee to help them with the thank you. That I'm going to make you all say that now, of the adaptation-relevant provisions of the Paris Agreement. And in particular, there are two that we really want your input on. One is reviewing the adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation and support provided for adaptation. And the other one is recognising adaptation efforts of developing country parties. So what we're going to do first of all is we're going to let Don Lemmen, co-chair, set us up and give us an overview, and then we'll have two specific interventions from Roger and Katherine. But off with you first, Don.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Vivienne. It's wonderful to see a full room today. It's been a really exciting conference, lots of discussion about the Paris Agreement and the implications of the Paris Agreement for research, for practitioners, for the community as a whole. What we'd like to do today is to take a look at what the agreement means a little more broadly for adaptation, and then some of the very specific tasks that the Adaptation Committee has to do to operationalize. And as Vivienne mentioned, in order to deliver on these tasks, we need your input. So a couple of words of caution. If you think that this is going to be a session where you're just going to sit back and be in receiving mode, you are incorrect. We are the information gatherers and you are the information providers for this particular session.
And I should say that at this point that it's going to be recorded. So we will be collecting your names, addresses, telephone numbers, email addresses. No, not seriously, but we will be, this is going to be an on-record event.
And hopefully we still get the frankest of comments, because that's what we need in order to make sure that we do the job well. The second thing that I wanted to caution on is that if you are a person who likes to sprinkle their conversations with words like modalities and as appropriate and inter alia, then you are a negotiator or you are a UNFCCC geek. And I can warn you in advance that this overview presentation I will be giving will not do justice to all of the important details and nuances of the Paris Agreement. Therefore, I certainly encourage everyone to read the agreement and the associated COP decisions really carefully. Well, there we go. So I'd like to spend a minute or so talking about what we are, what the Adaptation Committee, or the AC, as I will no doubt slip into the lingo over the course of this presentation, is. We were established in 2010 as part of the Cancun Agreement. We are the overall advisory body to the Convention of the Parties on Adaptation, and we have quite a broad mandate to raise profile of adaptation and to promote greater coherence in how adaptation is treated under the Convention and to the degree possible globally. Our functions include providing technical support and guidance to parties while respecting the country-driven approach, strengthening and enhancing the sharing of knowledge and good practices, which is clearly something we're learning a great deal about here, promoting synergy and strengthening engagement with relevant centers, networks, and organizations, also considering information on adaptation that is provided by parties on support received and needed, and finally, making recommendations to the Conference of the Parties on means to incentivize the implementation of adaptation action. That's what paper says about the Adaptation Committee. I don't really think it captures what the Adaptation Committee is. We are a group of 16 people from all regions of the world, and we work really hard together in an apolitical manner, which is not easy when you're working in a highly politicized environment. Many of the members of the committee are also negotiators, and we have this giant rack that we put outside the meeting door, and your negotiator hat goes onto that rack, and they come in, and we contribute our individual expertise to make a difference. Many of the AC members are here today, and if I could ask them to stand up and introduce themselves to the audience. Rensky, go ahead.
My name is Rensky, representative of the Netherlands and the Adaptation Committee.
My name is Hans, I'm Clifford Marlon. I'm from Jamaica, and I represent the group of Latin America and the Caribbean. Thank you.
I forgot to say,
Sorry. My name is Tamdian Dagwadar. I'm from Mongolia. I am representing non-Annex 1 countries.
I forgot to say, it has to all be done in the microphone.
My name is Klaus Radonski. I'm representing WEOC.
One more.
Yes, Ali from Maldives.
Thanks.
That's Ali Sharif from the Maldives.
Yeah, Min Peng Chen from China.
Surprise!
Thank you very much. And as we were preparing for the session, I asked the AC members to spread themselves out amongst the audience so you can see how effective a co-chair I am. So we have some real constraints in terms of our ability to get things done. We work very hard. We have a remarkably capable secretariat, but we're only 16 people. And to do our tasks, we need to draw upon a wide body of expertise, which includes all of you who are here participating in this session. Reaching out to stakeholders has always been an important part of the AC's work. All of our formal meetings are open to observers, and they contribute actively and significantly to our discussions. Each year, we hold an Adaptation Forum to reach out to broader audiences, and this event today is our forum for 2016. We hold expert meetings and workshops, produce publications of video and other types of outreach material, and it's only through the engagement of the broader adaptation community that we can hope to deliver what the parties have asked of us. I want to then briefly highlight the adaptation landscape under the UNFCCC before getting into the details of the Paris Agreement. There are programs, institutional arrangements under the Convention dealing with the science needed to inform adaptation, with knowledge and assessment, with planning and implementation, and also of addressing residual impacts. For the science expertise, we obviously have to reach outside of the convention process, and we're really happy that the IPCC responded positively to the COP21 invitation requesting a special report in 2018 on the 1.5 degrees C. I draw your attention to the Nairobi Work Program under the Knowledge and Assessment component, which I know many of you are partners of. And of course, the other element there, national adaptation plans, is a key driver and will grow as a key driver of adaptation in all countries, both developing and developed countries. Cross-cutting all of this work are issues of finance, technology, and capacity building, and obviously all are critical to advancing adaptation. And the AAC has been charged with bringing coherence and added value to the work of all of these individual initiatives. Turning to the Paris Agreement, I suspect it will be meaningful to this audience that the third preambular paragraph of that agreement recognizes the need for an effective and progressive response to the urgent threat of climate change has to be on the basis of the best available scientific knowledge. And when scientific knowledge is talked about here and later on in the agreement, it's used broadly. It's used inclusive. We include practitioner experience. We include local and indigenous knowledge. All are important for informing moving forward. Now, there's many ways you can break down the Paris Agreement, but it might be helpful to recognize that the central components involve global scale efforts, national efforts, cooperation, a transparency framework, which is a really important new element, and also a global stock take. So at the global scale, that's probably what the media picks up most upon. It includes the global temperature goal in Article 2, a long-term goal on mitigation, and a goal on adaptation as part of Article 7 that I'll talk about in a moment. But I also wanted to highlight the importance placed on collaboration as it relates to capacity building, policy coordination, and mobilization of support. Again, critical for adaptation. And I want to stress that the global stocktake, which assesses the collective progress towards achieving the purpose of the Paris Agreement and its long-term goals, while the initial stocktake does not take place until 2023, we have to very quickly get in place the modalities, there's that negotiator word, for how this is actually going to work. Now, I'm going to focus now on the adaptation article, if you will, Article 7 of the agreement. But I also want to stress that if you want to get a full appreciation for the significance of adaptation in the Paris Agreement, you need to read the whole agreement. There's lots of implications for adaptation throughout our other articles as well. So this slide is trying to outline the major aspects, if you will, of paragraph 8, so the first, or of Article 7. So the first paragraph is the global adaptation goal. It speaks of enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability to climate change in the context of sustainable development and the global temperature goal. The third paragraph refers to the adaptation efforts of developing countries needing to be recognized, and this repeats itself in the stocktake. The fifth paragraph is one that I think is quite interesting. It repeats ideas or builds on ideas originally in the Cancun Agreement, and it outlines what might be considered guiding principles for adaptation, and it acknowledges that adaptation should follow a country-driven, gender-responsive, participatory, and fully transparent approach, that adaptation should take into consideration vulnerable groups, communities, and ecosystems, and that it needs to, again, to be based on the best available science, traditional knowledge, and local knowledge systems. Paragraph 8 talks about strengthening cooperation, something we've heard a lot about at this particular meeting, including sharing of information and good practices, strengthening institutional arrangements, strengthening scientific knowledge, and assisting developing country parties. Para 9 is the one paragraph that states all parties shall. That's a unifying element of this agreement, all parties shall, and it talks about engaging in adaptation planning processes and the implementation of actions. Quickly then, paragraphs 10 to 12 talk about adaptation communications. That needs to be fleshed out a lot more in upcoming work. And paragraph 13 talks about continuous and enhanced international support for developing countries, with the final paragraph, 14, looking at the adaptation elements of the global stocktake. So, we have a long, perhaps somewhat dry, formal agreement. It's actually an outstanding agreement, and we need to operationalize it. That process is actually described in Decision 1 CP21, which goes along with the Paris Agreement, and again, strongly encourage you to read that in detail. With respect to adaptation, the Adaptation Committee has been requested to undertake 5 very specific tasks, and we do this recognizing the responsibility that has been placed upon us by the Conference of the Parties and the respect that is shown to us, and working in collaboration with the least developed countries expert groups. Those 5 tasks are up on the screen here. The first one involves reviewing the work of adaptation-related institutional arrangements under the Convention. That's one where we're pretty confident we have the knowledge to carry out on our own. But the remaining tasks are all things that we need to obtain information and ideas from parties, organizations, and individual experts such as yourself in order to deliver on them. So for the remainder of this form, we want to get your input on these ideas, and specifically the 2 that were highlighted by Vivienne. So developing methodologies on reviewing the adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation and support, and developing modalities to recognize the adaptation efforts of developing countries. And you see, since I couldn't see the screen, I had no idea I was 3 slides behind. These 2 tasks are obviously linked. The first is broader, because the first looks at the adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation and support in all countries. The second drills very specifically on recognizing the adaptation efforts of developing countries. So what we're seeking from you today then is input on what key concepts, approaches, and sources of information we should be considering when undertaking these tasks. To kick off the discussion, not tick off the discussion, Roger, that's the difference here. We've asked our two discussants to provide some of their thoughts on these questions. After that, we're going to open the floor to your ideas. As I said, this isn't a question and answer, but we know that everyone will have many questions. We have questions ourselves. This is to start the route into getting to those answers. We will intermittently turn to Roger and Katherine through the discussion to try to synthesize or explore some of the ideas that have been brought out. The very last thing I want to highlight here, thank you, Minpeng. We want you to bring all of your ideas here this afternoon so that you can stimulate feedback from others. But if you're anything like me, your most brilliant thought will hit you 2 days from now while you're out walking the dog. We still want that information. Could you please contact us through the email address that is on the screen there? Recognize this is an ongoing process. This will take time, and we need your input. So whatever form we get it, we greatly appreciate it. And with that, the Adaptation Committee goes into listening mode, and we're looking forward to your input. Vivienne, please.
Okay, so Don, that was fantastically clear exposition of the agreement and as it relates to adaptation. So now for the first of those questions, let's go to Roger Pulwarty of NOAA, who needs no introduction at all, of course. So that question is, what's needed to objectively review the adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation actions and the support for adaptations in countries?
Okay, great. I can speak into this thing. As Don said, what we're looking for, of course, even if it includes that great French phrase, l'esprit d'escalier, the thing you remember as you're going down the stairs, you certainly want to hear about it, if you'll pardon my French. So, as we think through this, is that the next one up? Yeah, I could speak.
No, we have the wrong deck.
I'll speak to anything that comes up. Do we have a... Welcome again to the Adaptation Futures Conference, where your inputs will be used. Okay, so how are we doing?
This is the kind of moment when the BBC usually says "Phil" in my ear.
Yeah.
But have you managed to...
Moving right along.
Yes.
So as we begin to speak through some of these ideas, as we'll flip through this thing, one of the things I wanted to do was basically speak to these slides. So I like to put down in the corner there, I have a signal that is a cautionary signal, and we'll talk to what that means. So what I'm going to do here is basically try and pull out of the IPCC reports and everything we've done to date on what we think is needed to help guide adaptation, how that might be related to what's in the COP21 agreement, if there's a match between them at all, and then ask the question, well, what are we spending on this, and then get feedback from the folks in the audience on the adequacy and certainly the effectiveness. We'll come back to what that actually means. I'm not going to necessarily define those terms as we speak right now, but really try to get that out of the audience. What I will do, however, is what from the research community we consider to be the adequacy, the adequate dimensions of things that need to be done. So let's think about this. We'll talk about adequacy and effectiveness. I always like to say there's a whole a set of warnings there, right? We're about early warning and we're about action, but we're also about caution in terms of planning into the future, right? So let's think about this. So this is from the SREX report. So we know what we ought to be doing, and the question is, to what extent do we have to pursue some measure of certitude to get at this? Reducing exposure, approaches to transferring risk, things we know about, things that are familiar to us. And the things that are not really as familiar, even though we've been using the terms for quite a long time, is this thing about increasing resilience to changing risks and transformation and even reducing vulnerability, really complex words that involve changes in human behavior and are not simply amenable to communication, because the things that create risks are really socialized actions over time and lessons over time. They're not simply amenable to communication. So when we speak about the actions out of COP21, I'm going to ask, well, from the IPCC reports, what do we know? So there's a bunch of things we're drawing on from this. In addition to the reports, there's the Sendai Framework and the many global assessments report of the UNISDR. And then around the world, the plans, I had to put up that nice one on the top because Clifford Malong was here, about how the Caribbean is transforming the way it's thinking, responding to climate change. So what are the lessons? Now, I'm putting up a slide here created by Ian Noble, where Noble sort of indicates a character trait as opposed to an inert gas. This idea here is what was in the adaptation chapters. Well, potential of enhancing the role of local government and the private sector, more information on increasing awareness is often not translated into action. That's what we hear a lot about. Adaptation has to be context specific, but as I said in the plenary, while it is context specific, the rules of engagement have to be more than context specific. And adaptation is only beginning to move from awareness to planning. Now, again, I'm not advocating a rush to planning and implementation either. The idea is how we do that in a cautious but yet an optimistic way. As people always ask me, do I think this will work? And I always said, well, I once thought about being a pessimist, and I thought that's not going to work. So let's move forward in terms of how we think through this. I wrote these out in particular simply because of, one, language issues, but also to give you something to sleep through. Early hazard-based approach was focused on drivers of impacts. More recently, we're asking these complex questions of information, capacity, finance, institutions, and technology. What did we learn from these many reports? Well, opportunities and constraints are unevenly distributed, right? Even when we come up with good risk financing schemes, some benefit others over others, like insurance, right? Those who can afford it purchase it, those who can't don't. So we have to think in terms of what some of these ideas are. And most critically, I'll discuss this in a second, this matters over time frames. This matters in the case of short-term actions that we take that look decisive but then create longer-term risks. And we know many of those, so we have to ask the question, how do we engage in the windows of opportunity? Many actors and roles are associated with successful adaptation. More and more, we're seeing this pressure to include the private sector, and I wanted to make the point that we didn't just think of the private sector yesterday, right? We've been trying to work out an ethical, equity-based understanding of how those partnerships should take place. But one of the most critical things here, I think, is understanding how we strengthen local governments in their provision of things like health, education, nutrition, and the role that they play in making sure that the benefits of actions are realized among all of their subcommunities, not just particular ones. Most assessments of adaptation are restricted to impacts planning to date, and few assess the processes and metrics, and this is where we're looking for help, of implementation and evaluation of actions. But those actions can't be just things that we tick off. All of us in the room who have to be accountable in our jobs know that we tick off actions that don't necessarily meet the goals of what we're doing. We tick them off just because we got them done, right? We held a workshop. That doesn't mean we did anything with the outcome of the workshop. So we think through this. A couple more I wanted to ask and these are all out of the IPCC and other reports, risk financing mechanisms, local, national, regional. We have to avoid providing disincentives, causing market failure and worsening equity situations. So a positive aspect of them, and also what we have to keep in mind as we go through this. Successful adaptation requires not only costs and benefits, and not all are investment-based. Now, this is something we're beginning to realize more and more. Throughout, and I'll mention this again, we've had this argument and discussion about the value of things like ecosystem services and the way we modify the natural environment to help us manage. But our actions aren't commensurate with having known that. So the question is, what in COP21 allows us to understand the available adaptive capacity of human and natural systems? And I want to keep in mind, as we talk about co-benefits, it's not simply saying, wow, this is going to cost a ton up front. We want to be able to show that, in fact, the co-benefits help us realize that adaptation might not be as expensive as we think it is, because we're spending money in those areas for co-benefits. So emergent risks, and this is a critical one we're facing, a lot of people see this, arise from indirect, transboundary, and long-distance impacts of climate change responses. In other words, it's local, but it ain't all local, right? The pressures that come to bear on a region and locality are forced from outside. As Clifford Mullen could tell you, the insurance rates in the Caribbean went up. We call it the insurance crisis in the Caribbean during the 1990s as a result of the Loma Prieta earthquake and Hurricane Andrew, none of which happened in the Caribbean, right? So that's just not even counting commodities, water, and migration. So where are we in thinking about this? I wanted to put this up because we tend to not articulate, even though all of us know in the room, that what we're dealing with are decisions that span several time frames, not one size fits all. From emergency response, resource allocation, and infrastructure. And if we look at Article 8.4 in the COP21 agreement, there's the request for things like early warning information systems, the integrated vulnerability and assessments and risk management, and somewhere in between is this question of how those two timescale produces surprise for slow onset event. And I think we haven't paid enough, and again, it's tough to do that in this room because these are the people who do pay attention to it, more broadly as a public on that intervening timescale where planning actually takes place. And you heard Christian talk about the 5 to 10 year timescale yesterday. So I wanted to show this. Stefan Halgat did this pretty neat analysis and does several neat analyses. The potential benefits from upgrading to developed country standards of early warning capacity gives us a benefit both for reducing risk and for co-benefits of anywhere from $4 to $35 billion. Well, we've known this kind of number for a long time, and I want to ask the audience as we think about implementing things out of COP21, why, in spite of knowing the economic benefits of many things, our actions are not always commensurate with that? Everybody says, yeah, if we knew the economic impact, we'd be acting, right? Well, it's not always clear that that's the case, so I wanted to be able to draw that out as we begin to look at these timescales and those issues out of COP21. So to begin to wrap up, and I'm not actually wrapping up, that gives the moderator confidence that something is happening, that I'm asking for a focus on capacity, learning, and improving decisions. I like to use the phrase, are we doing and not learning? We have a lot of things being implemented. How are we learning? Or are we learning and not doing? Usually it's learning and not doing. But we're doing a lot of stuff that we're not probably effectively drawing the lessons from. How learning takes place, and this is from the SREX report, monitoring, evaluation, some idea of learning, and a change in action, probably needs to be mapped out more carefully on the actions coming out of COP21. Because assumptions and people change, and capacity dissipates in between events and during different periods of time. In other words, we set up mechanisms and they disappear over time. And probably the most important issue in adaptation about assumptions, what we call system decompensation, the fact that the buffers are being used up in order to adapt. And that makes us even more vulnerable. As I always like to tell people, in the case of drought, the onset is not the issue. We have dams, we have got mechanisms for purchasing grain or moving emergency relief. It's when it intensifies and we've used up those buffers that we're in fact most at risk, and that's a measure of system decompensation. So there's a need for regional collaborative research and application networks. Some of these have been set up around the world. It's an effort, I think, the regional climate centers are trying to do, but it has to be informed by the goals of COP21, and that link to the global framework is not yet as clear. So, meeting the cost of adaptation in developing countries, we project, and you guys have done these numbers yourself, 28 to 67 billion. Between 2003 to 2014, it's 10.9, and if you do your detailed applied mathematics background, you'll see that there's a difference between those two numbers. So the idea here, though, is this. This is pledged, right? Not necessarily approved or deposited. When I teach, when I read my students' essays, I tell them, well, this is clearly cited but not read. In this case, it's pledged but not approved. Okay, so let's think through some of what that means. So to really wrap up here, where are we underestimating the complexity and how do we address it? I think it's really optimistic in the sense that it's forward-looking, right? Increase the recognition of those buffers and how they come to bear out of COP21. The fact that there's this governance issue at the local level in particular on where we can strengthen and legitimize good projects that are occurring and the coordination of implementation. And probably a big issue in terms of not just communication, but people's own awareness of their capabilities, of them understanding and addressing the co-benefits that come out of those actions related to practice. yesterday you heard a lot about, on the day before, well, you know, these things are in the Ministry of the Environment if they were in the Treasury. Well, the reason why that's a problem is because we do not acknowledge what the environment actually gives us economically, not because it should be in one ministry or the other. So I want to keep these in mind as we go through, and that's about it.
Terrific. So I hope you'll hold some of the questions that Roger posed.
We'll put them back up.
We'll put them back up in your mind. We're now going to go straight to Katherine Vincent's presentation. Katherine, of course, from Kulima. But her brief is this other bit of our discussion today. What can be done to effectively and efficiently recognise the adaptation efforts that have been undertaken by developing countries? So, Katherine, over to you.
Thank you. I think I drew the short straw coming after Roger because I'm afraid my presentation might not be quite as entertaining. I think, obviously, we all agree that adaptation needs to take place, and we kind of have an idea what it should look like, but not necessarily in reality. And until we know that, we're going to find it very difficult to know how we can effectively and efficiently recognise it. But I think what's been very clear for the last couple of days is that implementation is now very important. We're putting a lot more emphasis onto implementation. So this is obviously a very critical question. I just wanted to highlight, this is from the guidance for completing the national communications from quite a few years ago now. And I just wanted to highlight how this is obviously not a new question about how we can recognise adaptation. So what I've highlighted in red here about using appropriate methodologies and guidelines in the vulnerability and adaptation assessment part. So it very nicely says we should do that without actually giving any recommendations or suggestions on what those guidelines and methodologies may be. And so how is adaptation actually defined? I've put up here, this is the definition from AR5. And as we know, adaptation encompasses a lot of measures and a lot of different sectors, different geographical scales, and so on. But what I wanted to highlight here is this word process. So adaptation is not actually an end goal, which we hope to get to, and then we can tick off all the boxes and then all go home and sit watching TV all evening. It's a process that's ongoing, and I think this move towards talking about adaptive pathways kind of recognises that. But again, it makes it much more difficult to know, have we actually achieved it? Are we even on the right path towards achieving adaptation? Then, if we look at adaptation, we've got examples already of planned and autonomous adaptation. A lot of the planned adaptations are from projects. In the developing world, a lot of them are from projects which are implemented by NGOs or by donors, not necessarily by governments, although there are some of those as well. So I think the first obvious step to recognising those is obviously to have an inventory of them. You would think that's a fairly simple thing to do. In my experience in Southern Africa, where I work mainly, very few countries actually have that. So that's a bit of a problem, but hopefully something that could easily be rectified. The autonomous adaptation is much more difficult to recognise, mainly because when people are adapting autonomously, they don't necessarily realise that it's climate they're adapting to. I mean, we're all adapting to all kinds of challenges all the time. I was recently doing some research with commercial poultry farmers where I live in KwaZulu-Natal, and when we introduced what we were doing, said we were interested in how they're perceiving and responding to climate change. Oh, no, that's not a problem for us. It doesn't bother us at all. There are other things that are much more important, mainly politics. And then 2 minutes later, they're taking us round their chicken sheds, explaining how they've had to reposition them, put them in shade, and they have things like cooling pads where they run water through the top because the chickens, when they're too hot, don't eat as much, don't lay as much fat, and therefore they don't produce as much economically. But they had absolutely no idea that what they're doing is any kind of climate change adaptation. So this is also obviously a huge challenge if we're looking for something which we can't necessarily define very well. So if we only know we've adapted once we've been exposed to a particular hazard and haven't seen the adverse consequences, how else might we look at it? Well, we often talk about vulnerability reduction as well. But this is also problematic because we don't necessarily know what vulnerability reduction is. The Adaptation Fund and analysis of proposals submitted there showed that there was quite a lot of variability in how vulnerability is defined in proposals coming from different countries. And a lot of the projects that we maybe call adaptation are actually more about vulnerability reduction as well. We also tend to find when talking about reducing vulnerability, again, in a developing country context, we're actually talking about reducing vulnerability to poverty and making the assumption that that also reduces vulnerability to climate change. And I don't really think the two are exactly the same, although, of course, they are related. So is it really adaptation? When we're looking at things that say they're adaptation, are they in reality? I think what we see a lot of is actually more coping than adaptation. So coping, keeping us where we are in the present, but not actually doing something that will reduce our vulnerability when we're exposed to hazards and to incremental change in the future, which may be different to what we're seeing now. And obviously we do have a big adaptation deficit at the moment, which we want to address, but we obviously want to address that, ensuring that what we do now will be robust in the context of a future climate. And then also this question about adaptation and development. What I've put in the bullet point here, this is one of my stock phrases whenever I run training courses in Southern Africa, that all adaptation should be development, but not all development is adaptation. And a lot of development interventions are being rebranded as adaptation for obvious reasons, because there's billions of dollars floating around, as Roger's just mentioned. So it's not even enough to just kind of look at what someone says is adaptation. We actually need to look a bit further at that and see if it actually is, or if it's just being branded as such. But then I also think it's important to note that there's not much credit for progress being made with regards to adaptation, and Roger kind of mentioned this as well. Here I've got a picture of the floods in Mozambique from 2000 on the left-hand side, and that iconic image of the woman giving birth in the tree. Now, since 2000, Mozambique has been exposed to floods of a similar magnitude to what they saw in the year 2000, but it hasn't translated into such negative outcomes in terms of death and damage. And that's partly because of the good work that the National Disaster Management Institute in Mozambique has done with regards to early warning systems and disaster risk reduction efforts. But of course, they don't get front page coverage for having done that. No one ever gives them a pat on the back and says, oh, well done, you've actually addressed some of these challenges. Also, I have a picture here of Ethiopia, which, as I'm sure you know, this year the El Nino has wreaked havoc with the weather patterns, affected their production, and recently the president put out a call for food aid for 10 million people. So initially you might think, okay, adaptation, Ethiopia is no better off than it was in the early 1980s, but I actually think it is a lot better off, because if you look at these bags of food aid here, they're branded with the Ethiopian flag. This is because Ethiopia is much better prepared for these kind of events now than it has been in the past. And knowing that the El Nino was coming and the effect that it might have this year, they did undertake a lot of preparation, including stockpiling food supplies that they could distribute. So are these countries adapting to climate change and reducing their disaster risk? Yeah, I would say they're on the right path. But we don't see when there's no negative impact, and I think that's something that we need to be aware of as well. And then mainstreaming into national plans and policies. I know in quite a few of the sessions that I've attended over the last few days, we've spoken a lot about projects and moving from a project focus to a programmatic focus. But actually, in developing countries, developed as well, but in developing countries, we are seeing a shift into mainstreaming climate change and adaptation into national plans and policies, which is great. That's exactly what I think we should be doing. But it makes it even more difficult to know when adaptation is occurring and when it's actually being included. And we've had, with all the a lot of the finance mechanisms, the focus has been on looking for additionality, showing how you're doing something to add on to what you would do as normal to make it an adaptation. And that kind of shifts us away from this idea of thinking, well, maybe we should be doing things differently from the start. I think in terms of assessing adaptations, I mean, I've put this paper up with these examples of how we look at adaptations in terms of evaluating them, purely because it's from 2005. So again, quite a long time ago. We know how we should be evaluating adaptation, but again, if we don't know that we're seeing it, it's very hard to do. And just one other point that I wanted to make is that a number of countries are now using climate budget markers, so we can see how much of their national budget is being allocated towards climate-related activities and adaptation. But again, we have to look at, is what's being branded as adaptation actually adaptation or not? Is it just the use of the word? So I don't think I've answered the question at all, but hopefully that's a bit of food for thought for the discussion. And in true academic style, those are the references to the papers that I cited.
If in doubt, pose more questions. Yeah. Okay, terrific. Thank you so much. So 2 really good, clear presentations to start us off. What I want to do is concentrate on Roger's section first. So can we go back to that question? Have we got the questions to pop up?
How do we get back to the...
Right.
It's in the past now.
It's gone. So reviewing the adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation and support provided for adaptation. That's the one that we'll discuss first. We've got an hour for discussion, and what I would propose is that we do one and then we do the next. And I'm going to keep coming back to all of you. And as I said, here are the rules of the game. You are on the record, and you will need the mic before you can speak, in order that it can be recorded. And please, I don't know any of you from a bar of soap. So that means that if you go on for a long time, I don't know who you are and whether you're important. But if you're going on for a long time, I'm just acutely aware that there's a lot of interventions that need to come in. So I will snatch the mic away from you in a really rather rude way. And you know why the Brits are chosen as moderators is because we are 99% Mary Poppins, but 1% Mrs. Thatcher. So, and you know where we are at the moment in Brexit. Right, so let's...
1% has all the power.
Yes. So let's start. Who would like to start on this? Roger posed lots of questions. Who would like to start on some of the things that we need to do in that space?
Well, here's one.
Okay.
And so we're just to be clear, we're focusing on the adequacy and effectiveness.
Yes.
I just want to, so people bring those ideas forth.
My name is Nancy Sach, and I'm leading adaptation work at the European Investment Bank. And when you say support, people often think money.
Right.
So, and of course, we're a bank, so we like to think about money. But what I wanted to say is I hear a lot of people talking about adaptation projects, and what we see, not to say that there aren't adaptation projects and finance that needs to be directed specifically at adaptation, but we find that a lot of times people talk about those and forget the big stock of existing projects coming for other purposes. So new projects in which adaptation may be only a small financial component. The other thing is sometimes it may cost nothing. I know that's a little bit heretical, but if you build the same project somewhere else, it may actually cost less. So then how do you capture that? And we, with the other multilateral development banks, a bit below the political level, down at the techie level, we've been grappling with that. So how do you capture adaptation when it doesn't cost more? But separately, how do you get people to prioritize making projects resilient where the adaptation is only going to be a small financial bit, rather than everybody rushing to the big, shiny, new flood protection project where you can count lots? And lastly, I'm nearly finished, not only new projects, even harder, how do we retrofit existing cities and so on, where again, it may be quite hard to physically change them. Maybe we have to just change in the first time scale how we manage them. And that may be the low-hanging fruit, but again, that's not new finance, so how do we incentivize that? So I realize I'm like just opening it up a bit more, but I wanted to say that even as banks, we're conscious that the money doesn't capture a lot of the things. and that sometimes a bit of money in something else is as important as a big new adaptation project.
Thank you. Thoughtful intervention. Another thought. Right at the back. I'm going to fall over all of you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Habiba Gite from the World Bank. Thank you for the very clear sort of outline of what could be thought about. But on the first question, I see two different things in there. One is really in order to review the adequacy of any of the adaptation actions, you really think, to me, it means that you have to think about a framework about how you're going from the initial stages of adaptation process to whatever the end goal is. And the second part is a metric. And I'm wondering, amongst all of us in the room, do we have a framework for adaptation? I know we started that in the second assessment report of the IPCC, but have we really built on that will allow us to say what is adequate, and maybe take some lessons from the Sendai and the Hyogo framework and say, can we actually track what the adequacy means, as well as then measure the effectiveness of it?
Anybody want to come back on that specific point? Adequacy frameworks? You're very quiet this afternoon.
I cannot say that we have the framework. My name is Chen from Notre Dame Global Adaptation Index. And to echo Dr. Habib Jite's points about whether or not we have already such a framework, I don't dare to say that we have the framework. However, there are some efforts that can measure towards a goal that is not necessarily measured just by the money spending, but it's also how not only effectively, but also efficiently in terms of addressing the most vulnerable population in the world. For instance, the index that I have been working with, Notre Dame Global Adaptation Index, we have this focus on the most vulnerable, and we are trying to identify and recognize the need of adaptation, and also to recognize the effort developing countries already put in place. And therefore, it may be it is a framework, or maybe there are some other elements needed to be added so that a more comprehensive framework can go in towards that more measurement of efficacy and effectiveness.
Over there, and just tell us again who you are.
Hi, I'm Heather McRae with the World Resources Institute. And I think Habiba is putting us on a very useful track in proposing that a framework is the first place to start. The Hyogo and the Sendai frameworks are a helpful model, I think, and there may even be some good overlap there. The other framework that I think is very relevant to this question is the Sustainable Development Goals under the new 2030 Development Agenda, keeping in mind that adaptation really is not an end in itself, that we adapt in order to enable people to develop and thrive. And so using that framework as a touchstone, at least, as we think about this question, I think could be very helpful.
Okay, I'm going to take one more question and I'm going to come back to Roger.
Hi, I'm Katherine Gregg from the New York City Mayor's Office of Recovery and Resiliency. And I will just sort of attempt to be a little bit provocative and say the last thing I need is another framework. I actually am trying to retrofit 71,500 buildings that are in our floodplain, and I just want to know what are the measures that reduce flood losses and business interruption when employed, right? And how can we make them less expensive and less disruptive to people's lives in those buildings? So it's very well and good to think about boxes and PowerPoints, but it's really about tools on the ground in cities with individuals, and it sort of comes back to our plenary.
Okay, so I'm going to challenge you now. What ideally would you like? I mean, that you've brought us to a really important place. Yeah. So what would you like? What would an effective tool look like for you?
So I'm holding weekly meetings with FEMA, who gives us guidance. There are these
You want to say who they are? Yeah.
FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Association in the United States. They run our residential flood insurance program. And we need a list of concrete measures that can guide us on should we flood-proof a HVAC system in the basement of a multifamily building, or should we elevate it onto the roof? And if the roof is in disrepair, can we have money to fix the roof first and then move it up there if it's it goes on and on and on, right? But the guidance is a step-by-step playbook for the most effective measures to reduce flood losses in high-rise buildings and single-family homes that are attached and can't be elevated. So this is building stocks in historical, dense, urban, locales.
And are we back to co-benefits there? Because actually, people get their leaking roofs fixed.
It's not just.
It is about co-benefits, but it's about direct benefits. It's the direct improvements that you've, technically fixed so that the next time it rains. I mean, I keep telling FEMA that we've built bathrooms, right? They withstand, my children in the tub exploding water throughout the room, right? How do we make the basement floor or whatever the residential space is below, that it's going to be exposed when there's either tidal flooding in some cases or a storm surge, really, you mop it out and it's usable a day later. And I think we have some guidance, but we're not getting any incentive on the insurance side to take those actions yet. So it's really the cost benefit for if we take this action, we expect the losses to be reduced by X value.
Right.
Okay, I think that's a really helpful intervention. Roger, do you want to come back on some of that?
I think that's an extremely valuable intervention. From the standpoint of your comment as well, there is a link in the sense to the fact that in order to do those things, being able to show the direct benefit as well as the co-benefits actually can reduce the upfront scare of the cost of doing that, because then you're counting the benefits in many different ways. And I think you were getting at how should we do that? And I think that's an important question. I don't want to knock the idea of the framework stuff too much, but I agree with you. It's just that I sort of wanted, rather than us talking about a framework, we get these ideas and try to build one up, rather than creating, as I like to say, we don't need another needs assessment, which is nana. Right? But the idea here, though, is as we get these comments, I think it should feed back. It can feed back to a coordinated view, let's say. And I hear that a lot as well, right? We don't need another framework. But what I would like to get at is what are the pieces from what we're asking, one that helps you get the information that you need, but also helps us legitimize the support institutionally as well as economically to fund those activities. Because if it's only single benefit, then we're not making a case across communities. So.
Incidentally, the pubs by the side of the River Ouse in York, which floods frequently,
right.
They are done out as kind of wet rooms, and they just hose them down after there's a flood, and they're back drinking an hour later. So let's have...
Exactly.
I'm Willem Lichtvoet from the PBL Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency. I would like to point out that it's difficult to separate adaptation from any other thing.
Agreed.
So I would like to suggest that you talk more about climate inclusive development rather than separate adaptation.
Yep.
And as rightly said, all adaptation is development and not all development is adaptation. Right. So within each sector or department, you should be able to find information about how they deal with the climate inclusive development. And that's the one thing on the front. And the next thing is that you can assess the potential risk reduction which might be expected due to this planning or intentions or funding. Mm-hmm. So you need, I think, more an inclusive approach rather than a separate approach.
Mm-hmm.
So that risk reduction point is an important
It's
one
critical.
because actually a lot of organisations, they have risk assessment, risk reduction is a major part of corporate and organisational life.
Just to be clear, when we use the phrase, and I fully agree with you, in terms of the whole idea of mainstreaming is to do exactly what the gentleman just said. One thing we do have to keep in mind as we frame these in terms of risk is not all probabilities into the future are known. And as a result, many of the actions we're talking about can help us manage events of a certain magnitude and how they repeat, but not catastrophic events and not thresholds and tipping points. And that's a different sort of thinking that is much more along the lines of resilience than a probabilistic risk assessment. Unless you call everything risk.
Michael Mellon, OECD. I just slightly wonder if this is an answerable question.
That's a good.
Because I think there's the technical and practical difficulties which we've spoken about, but also, objectively review adequacy and effectiveness. This is not a technical question. This is value judgments. It's a political choice, and I wonder a bit. You have a report to write. You have an obligation, but whether there might need to be a bit of expectations management about what you're actually going to provide on this.
Underestimating the complexities of adaptation includes the complexities of knowing whether or not it's working.
Thank you. My name is Oscar Guevara. I work for the World Wildlife Fund, WWF. Just have two comments. The first one is that well, I have been working in adaptation for quite a long time, almost like a decade. And one of the things that I learned is that it's not on my hands and it's not good for my work try to solve IPCC's puzzle. It's just basically, I just don't use it because actually my adaptation work is actually be relevant and be effective in the ground and not trying to address UNFCCC's question about what is more vulnerable to others. I just need to somehow put on the ground two very simple principles, and that's the framework that I use. I reduce climate risk as much as I can, whether if it is anthropogenic climate change, natural variability, extreme weather events. It just basically I do what I do is reduce climate risk, and the other thing that I do is that if I cannot reduce them, I increase the adaptive capacity to cope with what is challenging. So that's my framework. It's just, how do I do that? That's a different, complete question. But actually, my framework is just very simple. I'm not trying to assess vulnerability. I'm not trying to assess resilience to a very complicated framework. I'm just trying to go practical. But just that was the first comment. And the second one is that somehow my sense is that since the 2012 report, the SREX and the RA5 report, I think that IPCC is a good support to what I say. Mm-hmm. But somehow just think that before the big elephant in the room was vulnerability. Everyone was trying to assess vulnerability through the IPCC framework. And right now everybody is trying to assess resilience, which are both complex concepts that are basically, they are adimensional, atemporal. You cannot just go out and measure resilience and measure vulnerability. And somehow I spent my time now trying to reduce risk, trying to increase adaptive capacity, and trying to explain why do I not try to assess resilience, because I don't know how, and I do not see the purpose of doing that.
Yeah. Can I make a quick comment, Vivienne? Because I would like to hear more from the gentleman, and certainly from WWF, on the idea of assessing adaptive capacity as we go around the room from others as well.
But also what I'm taking away from that is that the IPCC would like to have words that are understood by its constituents, right. But actually words that are understood by ordinary mortals are not the ones that are used by the IPCC.
Well, I would disagree. I think the special report on extremes were full of exactly the same comments you just made. Mm. So I really would disagree with that. But it supports the approach of not simply trying to reduce risk, but manage it, which is acknowledging that you're not going to reduce it to zero.
Okay. Lots of questions there.
Okay, in the theme of optimism, I want to ask you both a question regarding scales, and it seems
It's not
like
about asking us.
I'm providing feedback by asking an open-ended question.
You have to provide an answer.
Okay, that I will answer. Okay, so I will assert that we're probably in a situation where at the global scale it's going to be impossible to come up with the analog of degrees Celsius in terms of how prepared we are. Maybe we'll have a complex framework, but it will never be simple at that global scale. You could really imagine the world evolving to a point where at the level of nations there are indicators that are relevant and meaningful, if imperfect, and at the level of projects we have much better best practices in terms of how to do them. It seems like that universe of scales is terrifying and intimidating to the scientific enterprise, to the committee, but it doesn't necessarily feel hugely intractable. So is there room for optimism, even though this is really complex?
Okay, room for optimism. Hands up that there is room for optimism.
Oh, I'm Katherine Mock. I've left off that detail.
Is it in this room?
In this room.
Is this a room for optimism?
Okay. The pessimists amongst you?
You have a question? No, she has a question. She has a question, not a
pessimist. Great. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. I'm Shaila Shohid. Actually, I belong to a very remote coastal belt of Bangladesh I'm coming from. So I like to focus on a very local level problem with the adaptation, because I like to focus on the second question, what can be done.
I'm going to hold that because I want to keep that, not the second.
Okay.
Second bit, number two on that.
Yeah, number two.
No, we're going to come to that in a moment because I want to go this. Review the adequacy of effectiveness.
Unless your comment has to do with effectiveness, which...
It's a kind of link, okay. But
I gave you an opening.
These are definitely not isolated. These are obviously these are linked. So I'm just wondering about the governance aspects of this adaptation regime, because when we talk about the mainstreaming of risk reduction and also the adaptation, we actually found that while talking about mainstreaming, all the ministries actually somehow they are taking initiative for mainstreaming the CC and DRR. And then there are overlapping, there are conflicts, and also there are avoiding of responsibility when it goes to the very ground level or local level implementation and people suffers. So actually what we can think how actually we are going to address these kind of problems to bring the efficiency of adaptation.
Okay.
It's a good question.
Good question.
I'm Suri Babu, representing a developmental financial institution from India. Here, adaptation, the requirements are too far and wide, and definitely what is needed is the prioritization of what is to be done and where it is to be done. For this, I think perhaps every nation should come out with a specific action plan, like defining the framework and priorities for the country, or perhaps even down to the province or state level. In fact, this is something which India, we have already done it at national and also at different state level. Action plans are prepared. That gives us the broad framework of what should be my priorities in funding it. Especially as a development financial institution, funding some of these propositions, this gives us the priority there.
But how do you assess the adequacy? When you're doing that prioritization, how do you assess the adequacy? What's your yardstick?
No, actually, adequacy is something that is, adequacy means only when we mobilize the resources, we'll be. See, when resources are limited, where I have to prioritize what is to be done first, which is more vulnerable to address. I mean, that is where we identify the areas, then depending upon the funding availability, maybe from the government resources or from the outside resources, we'll be in a position to assess the requirement and then fund it. But main thing is what should be our core areas of priority, considering the vulnerability factors.
Good. Yeah, no, that's helpful. I think it ties back to your comment because it also asks the question about what's the link between who decides and who benefits, and that's the governance question, right?
Barney Dixon from UNEP. A footnote and a comment. The footnote was to Roger's slide on support for finance for adaptation. UNEP a couple of days ago released our adaptation finance gap reports, which I think has got slightly more up-to-date figures. I think the good news is that we would current financing available, public international financing available for adaptation for developing countries is currently, I think, well, in 2014 was 22.5 billion. The bad news is that our estimate of costs, 2030 costs, is higher.
That's
So
the point.
we're talking, I think, of somewhere in the region of 140 to 300 billion annual costs per year for adaptation in developing countries. Now, clearly, that gap, and now we come to the comment bit, that gap is not going to be filled by international public finance. Some of it will be filled by national finance for national support for adaptation within countries, and some of it, and this is the really big unknown, by private finance of both international and national finance, private finance for adaptation. And well, this is sort of turning into a question. But the challenge with that private finance is to what extent is that private finance going to contribute to overall societal adaptation? One can imagine how private finance can contribute to the corporation's own resilience, but actually be maladaptive from a broader societal point of view, and one can imagine the opposite. And I think the public sector probably has a very important role there in ensuring we move more to the latter scenario than the former.
But I'm going back to the question here, which is how does a corporation, which perhaps doesn't have the experience and knowledge that all of you have, how does the corporation go about assessing the adequacy and effectiveness of proposals that are before it? I'm just going to take.
Well, maybe we can begin. This is Claudia Bendaño. I represent Coastal Environments International Planning Adaptation. Good. Maybe we could start by an inventory of measurements. It's obvious that we all deal with the same type of climate change effects. Our chickens are dying, our water is rising, our beaches are eroding. So if we make an inventory of actions that we already taken and somebody just classify it, this was the problem, this was the action, these are the benefits, these are the co-benefits, then you can start by deciding how effective or ineffective that adaptation measurement was according to how many stars, how many dots, or how many objectives.
So it's kind of benchmarking, I guess, yeah? Just one here.
Thank you. My name is Anne Olhoff. I work with the UNFCCC partnership. So just going back, if we're trying to see what's objectively needed to review the adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation action in relation to the global goal of adaptation in the Paris Agreement, I think we all agree that it's wonderful that we have a global goal on adaptation, but it's also wonderfully vague. So unless it's specified in more detail, you can't review the adequacy. But I also think that coming back to some of the other interventions here, and especially about the metrics, we need to know more specifically, what are the goals and what are the metrics for measuring whether what we're doing is adequate. And of course, going back to the comment about the scale, the scale is extremely important there. We have to move all the way from local to global scales, but there will be a lot of similarities across those scales. Mm-hmm. And finally, I think the INDCs actually provide a really good starting point for narrowing down what are the goals from country to country and across countries, and how can we review the adequacy of action.
Yeah, good. There's somebody here as well. I want to keep this in mind as we keep talking about scales, that we keep talking about events and responses, but there's a temporal scale to all of those adaptations, right? Because there's a difference between an adjustment on that time frame and an actual adaptation over time.
So we've got 5 minutes left in this part of the discussion, and we've got two competing. So take that one there. But sir, make it short, because now I want to get as much. If anybody's got any questions in this part or suggestions, I want you to make them now, because otherwise they will be lost.
So my short intervention, this is Ira Feldman, I'm putting my ISO hat back on in response to the comment about too many frameworks and not enough direct guidance, and how do we objectively review adequacy and effectiveness. You can't do that without standards. Right. And so that is why ISO has embarked on a very robust process of developing context-specific standards.
It's a good comment, and that gets at the accountability versus efficiency bridge that I wanted to get at, because accountability can seem to slow things down, yet you don't get long-term action.
Yeah, hi. My name is Marcus Oxley, and I'm with a civil society network working on disaster reduction. I've kind of been in 3 days of back-to-back intensive sessions where I'm being presented by what what adaptation actions are. And although the panel says that adaptation is very much meant to be a process of adjusting our development processes to make them more climate sensitive, what I'm very much seeing in the presentations is that adaptation as an end in itself. And particularly I'm seeing this in developing countries where at the local level there just isn't any development funding. And therefore, as a substitute to that development funding, they're setting up local adaptation funds as a way to get international resource and bring it down to the local level to essentially finance developmental work. And my concern is that by putting a price tag of $600 billion per annum on adaptation by 2030, essentially we're setting up the mother of all silos, which an adaptation silo, which yet again serves to fragment our developmental processes, when what we really need is to understand how to bring together our development processes.
It's a good speech, but I'm going to take the mic away from you. Question over there.
Yep, thank you. My name is Jesse DiMaria-Kinney from Oxfam, and just a very quick, observation here. In terms of the adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation actions, this goes very much to the question of scale and a few of the other comments, but actions by who? Kind of actions for who? So, of course, within this context, we're looking at nation states, but when we look when we get more into the detail, are we looking at actions taken by the countries? Which groups of people within the countries? Are we looking at the 1%, the 99%? Who will benefit and how? Right. And I hope we're not depending on a trickle-down effect from national adaptation plans to the most vulnerable.
I'm with you.
Okay, we've got 2 minutes. Last comment from anybody. Super fast there. But very brief.
Until Paris meeting, I believe that God is getting us warmer, making us warmer. Now I see that human greed is the reason. So why we're not trying to control the human greed? Thank you.
Okay. Not a direct answer to the question, but hello.
Yeah, Christian Rodin from the World Meteorological Organization. Two quick things relating to a question. First, in a risk-informed future and decision-making, I think we should put a lot of emphasis on reducing exposure first, rather than vulnerability. Well, that's one thing. Second comment is, I guess that any adaptation should bring with itself also mitigation. I mean, in a climate-sensitive world, I mean, anything which contributes to the development and work and fighting climate change and reduce risk should be such that it diminishes the emission as well. So perhaps that would be a way also to package those things more effectively.
Thanks very much. Okay, Roger, final reflection on your part there.
So from the standpoint of all of these pieces, I think we're actually getting somewhere about how we put the pieces together in the context of COP21. Now, it's always well and good, to sound positive at the end of something like this and say it's great, and boy, isn't this working just fine? Well, but it's not, right? The idea is we haven't really gotten at what are the impediments to getting some of these things done. We've gotten the recommendations on what ought to be done. And in fact, from the standpoint of, and I'll give you a classic case, and this was raised in spades just now. Public-private partnerships, yes, not one or the other, but what combinations are needed and at what scales. Right? That is actually a battle, as we point out, that strengthening local government and the interaction of the private sector is going to be so critical, but it's not a conflict-free arrangement, and we have to acknowledge that in this context. I think the issue to keep in mind, as many people have said, is that adaptation is an outcome of good governance and practice. And we sort of need to keep that in mind, otherwise it becomes another catch-all for everything under the sun as well. From that standpoint, we do have to be very clear about just managing for certain outcomes and outputs, independent of the system functions of society that we want to help preserve in a changing climate. Now, we're not responsible for all of those things happening, and that has come out in spades as well, right, in the context of development and environmental management. So one of the things I think we sort of do need to do is, a lot is happening on the ground, and I'm not as clear, and part of my job on the fifth assessment was to look at some of these cases, but there's so much happening in the public-private sector that we were not able to assess or ask about. And so how we really learn from each other is really not that clear, and the IPCC process it's not its goal anyway. But out of getting the benefits of COP21, the distillation of lessons for planning and practice and all of the things that were mentioned, how they are addressed, that needs to be done in in what's being done in the grey literature as well.
And of course, forgive this blindingly obvious thing from an outside source, is ask the people who are affected whether they feel safer or more secure by the adaptation plans that have been presented to them.
I agree, but you also get an answer that they think they want to give you. And so, or that you want, right? So that I've had enough anthropologists that you get rid of very quickly by giving them the answer. So just
right,
measuring
okay.
that.
That's put me back in my box. Okay. Okay, let's move on now to the questions posed by Katherine's presentation. What can be done to effectively and efficiently recognise the adaptation efforts that have been undertaken by developing countries? And Katherine posed several questions just to remind you, is it an inventory of autonomous adaptation? Is it vulnerability reduction? Is it really adaptation, or is it just coping? There's not much credit for progress, was I think one of your points. Okay, let's have some thoughts in that arena about recognising the adaptation efforts of developing countries. Who'd like to start me off? Marvellous.
Hello, I'm Rianti Jalante. I represent UNUEHS in Bonn, but I have also lived and worked in Indonesia. I think the Center Framework for Action has laid some great foundation in terms of recognizing it and strategies to do it. I mean, if we know that loss is reduced, economic life and impacts are reduced, that's, I think, one way that we know that there has been some effective measures. Risk has been reduced and managed. That's, I think, another way of looking at it. And I think within developing countries, focusing at the local government and community is the key. If the community's well-being have been improved, we can measure it probably by their change of consumption, changes in saving and incomes. I think that would be a good measure in terms of targeting the real, the poorest of the poorest or the most vulnerable out of it. And because I think it is important because their savings, their sensitivity of measuring their sensitivity of falling back into poverty when there is a climate change shocks have been reduced. I think that's also another way of looking at it at the community. And within local governments, if there is tools available, if there are resources available, and they also be held accountable to the community they serve, I think that would be a way of effectively and recognizing the efforts has been working on the ground. Yes, thank you.
Okay, any other thoughts? There's one at the back here.
Thank you. My name is Timo Leiter. I work for the German Development Agency. And so a number of countries are currently developing their national adaptation monitoring and reporting frameworks. We had a session on this yesterday. For example, South Africa is due to publicly release its first climate change progress report in a couple of weeks. The Philippines will want to do the same by the end of this year. A number of countries want to join this, Costa Rica, Colombia, Cambodia. So this would be an excellent source to very efficiently collect what these countries are doing. In fact, GIZ partnered with the Adaptation Committee and the Least Developed Country Expert Group to develop some guidelines on how to develop these systems, which we also presented yesterday. And if you're interested, I invite you to check out our website, adaptationcommunity.net, to see these guidelines. Thank you.
I'm Pema Tenzin, and I'm from Bhutan. Basically, the effective and efficiency, especially recognizing the adaptation effort, is look at the country and then whether they have a strong framework, or you can say adaptation. For example, we say National Adaptation Program of Action, or Sectoral Adaptation Plan of Action, or local government plan to actually adapt, because we face the brunt of climate change, and we know, and then we have been living there, we are living there, so we know what to do best. So my request here would be just to see whether it's effective or not, give the ownership, actually give them the liberty to do, and then what we need is, because we are LDC, we lack fund, and therefore maybe if we could give the ownership, whether it's, we know best how we can actually adapt to climate change. So provide us the fund, just see that these are very climate, whether it's efficient or not. But I think I would like to basically request here that it has to be, the ownership has to be given. Thank you very much.
Can I just ask you, because Bhutan, of course, is famous for its gross national happiness index, and I'm not being facetious here. Is that a potential method of recognising? I mean, could that be helpful?
Obviously, these elements are basically embedded in the GNH philosophy, and we have this very important component on environment, and that actually also encompasses climate change. Now, when we actually break it down, we just don't leave it to gross national happiness, and we actually break it down to mainstream plans. Within the mainstream plans, we also have elements of environment, as well as how we actually take our things towards climate change and all. So therefore, from that angle, it's kind of inclusive, and that's where we actually break it down. Like I was saying, a broad framework, a broad GNH as a guiding philosophy to mainstream plan, and then we actually accordingly take it from there.
Okay.
Good. My name is Luc Yankaja. I'm speaking for the board of the Climate Adapting Local Facility. And one of the things I would like to highlight here is that in many of the developing countries, natural resources managers, especially farmers, are adapting with their meager resources. I've seen in countries like Burkina Faso or Niger, farmers manage natural regeneration. They are doing it out of their resources. How do we recognize that? And how do we enhance it and scale it up? Another point is, how do we... Well, I suggest that we also invest into local government ability to remain in adaptive management mode. Then help them to enhance what they know to do best.
Thank you very much. I'm Fakri Karim. I come from the same look from the local program. I have another suggestion on that, is to invest more on the existing traditional customary law on how they deal with this climate change effect. Like in Pacific, in Bhutan, in some other specific place. They've been dealing with this many, many years. And they do have way to deal with this. But when we come in down to that situation, we come with something new. We tell this is how you should do. And then they kind of forget what they have before, and they try to do what we do. And then at the end, it doesn't really bring them to resilience. And it is hard for them to do because they don't have capacity. Mm-hmm. So if they do their own way, they do have a capacity, but we need to support them how to best use of the system and the existing capacity to be resilient. Thanks.
Thanks. Katherine, some thoughts from you?
I agree pretty much with everything so far. I think one of my concerns with the the Sendai framework, of course, you have to outline the development of plans and policies. One of my concerns, again, from a Southern African context, where we're really great, well, in South Africa, we're great at writing policies and plans. We're not so great at implementing them. So I think we have to be careful that, it's not just, okay, we have a policy on something, tick, we're adapting. And again, I think something that's very tricky with regard to measuring, say, community well-being is, well, we already have a human development report which captures development indicators, but I think we need some way of showing is that development adaptive or not? Is it climate resilient or not? And I think that's the challenge for us, is to be able to find that, so that then we can measure that accordingly.
Okay.
One comment. In this specific question, I think that the INDC process was really an extraordinary experience from, and actually referring to this question, is that even though there are a large number of countries that set up their adaptation targets in a very prototypical way, that saying that they will reduce vulnerability and increase resilience, which basically means whatever. Some of them really make a very good ones. Especially, I'm familiar with the ones in the Latin America, for example, Mexico's and Colombia's, that are actually, they are saying what exactly that means for a country. And somehow that's the way, if, for example, in the UNFCCC, they try to highlight which those good examples of what it means reaching adaptation goals for developing countries, that will be great, because somehow I always thought that we need more adaptation leaders. We need people and organizations and countries that are actually setting up and say what is good adaptation and how they are going to do it, and how they are planning to monitor their progress in delivering adaptation benefits. And again, I will say that in the INDC process, there are some great examples, and somehow if there is much effort in trying to highlight those examples, I'm sure that many countries will follow that path. Because again, some people say, well, I didn't know that that was an adaptation goal. If I knew that, well, maybe I should write it. But yeah, again, well, I can say, for example, Latin America, Mexico, and Colombia made a great work on those, and that they are moving forward the way to deliver effectively and efficiently adaptation efforts.
So perhaps, Katherine, that speaks more to celebration of stories that people perhaps don't themselves recognise as being adaptation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it goes back to the point about the M&E frameworks as well. I think if we combine maybe what policies and plans and what mechanisms are in place with evidence that they're being monitored and evaluated with adaptation in mind, I think that would be a step forward.
And there's a big potential use for social media and crowdsourcing.
As a
this
source of
area.
data, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Any other thoughts about recognising? Right. Let's go to you. One there.
Should I start?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, my name is Aris Teba. I work for the Stockholm Environment Institute, and I have two suggestions I would like to highlight. And the first one would be focusing more about streamlining the global finance architecture, which today can consist of one bilateral, one multilateral, one UN fund, and then you have another multilateral and a third bilateral development agencies who are all working in one area, and they channel funds through various climate funds, through vertical funds, through ODA, to various implementing entities, both regional, multinational, national, and then they go to various recipients, but there is not always any coordination between these actors, and a lot of that funding is channeled beyond or outside of the reach of the national budget, of the national government that is supposed to coordinate all these actions. And another point is that, and this is not something I'm not sure that the national adaptation plans would be able to solve, but if you look at, because they're following an UNFCCC methodology, so to speak, but if in a developing country's national development plan is to build a hospital, which would increase resilience of local people and would be the top one action to implement. But an adaptation fund or an international actor wouldn't find that as deemed to be suitable for adaptation finance, then there is a discrepancy and also a reason for not recognizing adaptation efforts that are undertaken by developing countries. And I know Roger said that we need to we should have adaptation as a little bit more narrow, as not to include everything. But in some senses, a hospital should be included as an adaptation, and even access to energy or even energy efficiency, for example, would be in some senses seen as adaptation efforts.
So it could be simply that you're having your generators and you've got a whole load of other measures in place for if power fails, or
if that is what is in the national plan, then that should be something that should be promoted even through adaptation measures. Yes.
Okay, let's go to you.
I guess that I had a question about this.
And just say who you are again.
Sorry, I'm Heather McRae with the World Resources Institute, and I've been puzzled since Paris by this particular mandate to the Adaptation Committee. I'm curious, what is the purpose of this recognition? And listening to the conversation here, it sounds like some people see it as an opportunity to highlight good examples that other players can learn from. Others seem to see it as an opportunity to really better define adaptation and distinguish it from business as usual. Others seem to see it as linked to finance and to very practical resource type recognition. And I wonder if anyone on the Adaptation Committee has good answers to this.
Is it all?
Right. Don, would you like to take that one?
Yeah. No, I don't want to take that one. Because I did put the condition that we weren't answering questions. But I will. I didn't. The points you come out with are exactly the issues that the Adaptation Committee is grappling with and that the UNFCCC process is grappling with. We have agreed language that all parties have endorsed in the Paris Agreement, and we move forward with that language, recognizing that there are going to be multiple interpretations of what it means. We've got some time. We've started to scope out here what the breadth of what that might mean is, and in time, hopefully we will get some convergence. But this is an exercise that is going to take place as part of a global stock take, and we want it to be informed by the best ideas and the best information, and that's what we're starting here. So it doesn't surprise us in the slightest that the discussion is broad, and there is no answer to your question.
And that's why what you're saying is really important. So I'm going to come to you in a second, because this is a gentleman who's been waiting for a while.
Oh, good.
So my name is Joachim Nibbe. I'm from Nature Friends Germany, and we are engaged in the adaptation discussion from the civil society in the last years more and more, and especially also in the standardization debate. So as Ira Feldman mentioned already, ISO is also working on standards and adaptation, especially now on a vulnerability assessment standard. And also, as my colleague Timo Leitner from GIZ mentioned, GIZ is also very active in this. They have to build up a vulnerability assessment handbook. And I want to stress also that we should avoid double working. So there should be a better coordination, and also to stress that the development countries over their national standardization bodies, over their stakeholder about the civil society should be engaged more and more. I know that it's very hard, also because the question of resources and financing, but we should try to make this also to have a speech from the civil society in the standardization debate.
Okay, thank you. And of course, very difficult to try and sufficiently involve all stratas of society, particularly the most vulnerable.
Hi, I'm Florence, a researcher at the Grantham Research Institute at LSE. And I suppose just one point kind of building on the comment from Heather, but I just think we should be a little bit cautious with the idea of kind of developing an inventory. I think there's a difference between effectively and efficiently adapting and actually listing effective and efficient kind of adaptation efforts. And I think that's something to bear in mind when looking at this, and not to fall in the trap of thinking that we can adapt by piecemeal and kind of ad hoc projects being developed kind of on the ground. You know, I don't think that's the way we'll be adapting. So I would just be a little bit cautious with this effort in terms of what we want to do with it, and remembering that difference between effectively, efficiently adapting and actually listing effective and efficient adaptation efforts.
Okay, good point. Pass you along the line.
Okay, Mikael Hildén from the Finnish Environment Institute. To follow up a little bit on that, I think there's a danger. We see and Katherine also mentioned that we are very good at making good plans and nice-looking strategies, but then forgetting about the implementation. Now, the implementation is, of course, not just piecemeal efforts, but it's also systematic existence of things like disaster risk preparedness and so on, that goes back to fairly concrete things on the ground. And I think there should be more emphasis on recognizing the existence or lack of those at the level of action. And that could help in getting this credit. Thanks.
Okay, helpful, thank you.
Well, thank you. To recognize, yes. Okay, again, okay, Luc Yankaja for local climate adaptive living facility. To recognize, you must be able to see. Sometimes our lenses or institutions' lenses doesn't allow them to see. So we must make sure that lessons learned from adaptation programs are reflected in existing policies and also used to improve existing institutions.
Any more questions on this before I... you were hiding behind a pillar.
Thank you very much. Sönke Greff, Team Leader, International Climate Policy at Germanwatch and also prospective PhD candidate. One thing, if we talk about recognition, I think we generally have to start and think about how does it work right now. And I think there's a long way still to go. If you, for example, look at the IPCC, there's no reference to the Cancun Adaptation Framework, which is the document at the time of the IPCC, which by country governments were actually dealing with this kind of issue. And I think we really have to think about that also science and practitioners really relate to these kind of frameworks, because all the questions are in there already. Of course, only the headers, but necessary. Otherwise, it won't work. And I think if we grapple with that kind of question, we can then also think about more granular ways of recognize action of countries. And I personally think we need to get into a peer mood on this one, facilitative, so that countries basically are proud of what they're putting in this kind of document, and that by that we can improve also the state of adaptation in these countries.
Okay, thank you. So just let's, one more comment here, and then we'll just wrap up from Katherine.
Michael Mullen from OECD again. I completely agree with Heather's question, and I think, in a way, recognize can mean I recognize this by giving you money, or recognize meaning I put it on the website. But I think, given the way that's phrased, and given that the effectively and efficiently seem to qualify recognize rather than adaptation, the effective and efficient way is that you look at the national adaptation plans, you look at the national communications, you invite people to send you examples of good things, and you put it in a report.
Okay. So, Katherine, I want to go back to you, first of all, to sum up this part of the conversation.
Okay, well, I think what I would say to that last comment probably sums it up, which is, but are all of those things adaptation? Whatever it might be written as adaptation, is it necessarily? And I think that's the key here. And also for this question of linking adaptation with development. I mean, I have no problem with local governments that are poorly resourced in developing countries setting up adaptation funds to get money, if what they're going to do with that is adaptation and climate resilient development. If they're going to do what they were going to do anyway, then that's more problematic. But otherwise, I don't think that's a problem. What else do I have? Yeah, I think that's... Yeah.
So I think a summary might be, this is a really difficult question.
Yes.
We've only just begun to flesh it out, but it does need a lot more work, clearly, and we have a lot of other people to involve in these discussions before we get a clearer route forward. Ming Peng, co-chair, would you like to close for us?
Thank you, Vivienne. Yeah, I think it seems very clear to me that the 1 hour and 45 minutes are not enough to discuss two difficult questions. But we have to close today. But actually, this is only the start of all the dialogues on these issues. And also, I want to stress that although it might be a little bit late, that what we want is the modalities and the methodologies. So I encourage all of you, could you please not to stop thinking, and because we are desperately need all your inputs and insights on these issues, how to develop the modalities to recognize the adaptation efforts of developing country parties, and also the methodologies to review the adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation action and supports. So every words you have said today have been very well recorded. So they will be very good inputs to our future work. So I thank you, all of you, for your very fruitful and intensive discussion today here. And also let's applaud to Vivienne for her excellent facilitation of our discussions. And also, I would like to extend our appreciation to Roger and Katherine for inspire our thinking on the two very difficult questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Finally, I would like to express our gratitude to Annette, Ina, and Olga from our secretary who organized this session very perfectly. Thank you very much, and please don't hesitate to provide any inputs to us. Thank you.
Hi. I'd like to